Hello everybody, and thanks for joining today. We're going to wait a couple of minutes to give everybody time to arrive. If you want to put in the chat box a little bit about your name and where you're from, that would be fantastic, so I can see who's with us today. Okay, great to see everybody who's just arrived. If you could, perhaps while we're waiting for everyone else to register, just let me know who you are, maybe where you're from. Thanks very much, Becky and Veronica and Fiona. Hola and bonjour. Much prefer doing these things live, but and hopefully next year the language show may go back to being live. But at least it maybe gives lots of you a chance to take part if you wouldn't have normally been able to go to London. So thank you to everybody who's already put in the chat box who you are, where you're from. Anybody else who's due to join us, please do the same thing as well. And we're going to give it probably at least one more minute to give people a chance to join. Okay, hello there. Gosh, we've got somebody here from Melbourne. That's really exciting. Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to start and introduce myself. So I'm based in Yorkshire, in Huddersfield, and a lot seems to have happened since the last year. I actually did a session for the language show virtually while I had COVID last year, and I ended up having been ill for 3 weeks. So it was quite a struggle last year. So I'm glad to say that I'm in full health, not had COVID again, and it's been quite a year. I'm a head teacher of a secondary school in South Yorkshire, and it was actually my first year last year as a head at that particular school, so it was quite a challenging first year. Lots obviously has happened. Lots of my colleagues caught COVID, lots of students as well, but things are looking a lot better at the moment. So it's not maybe as, how can I say, it's not such a sexy title, effective assessment. However, I'm a really strong believer that assessment is absolutely vital, really, in terms of everything we do, in terms of designing our schemes of work, where we want to go, our short, medium and long-term plans. We actually need to know what it is we want our students to be able to do and achieve by the end of it. And I've had this conversation many times with colleagues before, but I actually believe that you need to know what your assessment looks like, say at the end of a term or a module or the end of a whole course. And therefore, if you know what your assessment is, you are going to be teaching appropriately and making sure that your activities in the lessons eventually lead up to students being successful in those assessments. Some people say, well, you should write your schemes of work and your lesson plans and resources before and then assess after, create your assessment at the end. I actually don't believe that's the case. And part of my thinking has come from someone called Paul Sambayo-Bambrick, who has written Leverage Leadership and also Data-Driven Learning. And I strongly believe in his thinking that we need to know what the end point is and then we can work backwards from it. So I'm going to talk now for probably a bit under 40 minutes. I'm going to finish a bit earlier, and if you've got any questions, please put the questions in the chat as you're thinking about it, but don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A box, please, because there's a little box at the top of your screen, hopefully, that says Q&A. If you put any questions there, I won't answer them immediately, but I will spend a few minutes at the end of this session answering them. So as well as being a head teacher, I'm also a writer of language teaching resources. I've written them for Key Stage 2, 3 and 4, so sort of ages 5 to 16 in French and Spanish. And I've also been an Ofsted inspector previously. And I run quite a lot of training and speak at conferences like this regarding effective practice in language learning. I've also actually just co-authored a book with Juliet Park called The Ultimate Guide to Teaching Primary Languages, and that's going to be published by John Catt in January, actually in a couple of months. And in that there is a chapter on assessment, as you can imagine. So let's get straight on to it. So I'm going to start with the Ofsted framework. So if you're from England, which I think the vast majority of you are from, apart from one person from Melbourne, but it's probably not that much different over in Australia, is that assessment helps people to embed knowledge, use it fluently, and it assists teachers in producing clear next steps for pupils. However, Ofsted does also say that it's often carried out in a way that creates unnecessary burdens. Therefore, it's important to understand its limitations and avoid misuse and overuse, which I think is really important. So we don't want to over-assess, we don't want to keep weighing the pig all the time. However, we might not always call it this, but all the time in lessons as we teach, we are always assessing our students in the sense that we're always checking, did they understand this particular thing? Have I taught it well? Has it been properly embedded? And we're doing that all the time. And then we are often doing what's called responsive teaching, which means changing what we're teaching based on our immediate understanding of what our children, what our pupils have learned or not learned, and therefore reteaching. So that is effective, what's called formative assessment. So I want to give you an example of what I think is one of the most effective ways to quickly formatively assess children in a lesson, and this works for any age really. I think translating sentences ideally into the target language, but you could do it the other way around. So it could be from the target language into English if all you want to assess is more the productive understanding. But I think the real sort of proper understanding, if they can translate it into the language, then they could do it the other way anyway. So this is probably the most important thing. But asking children to do this, giving them either you saying a sentence in English and then them having to write it on a mini whiteboard is really effective. Or you could have the sentences ready up on the board, something like this. This is quite a simple one, so I'm aiming at Key Stage 2, so children at primary school. But I often like to add an underline section, an extension section to a task, because as always, we have children of different levels of ability in the same class. So if you pre-prepare it like this, you can add in extra sections for those who are able to. So we quite often find that children are writing at different rates, they think at different rates, some of them are much quicker than others, and therefore it's good practice to have something as an extension, which is a nice way to show that you expect something more from some children. That would be another example, the use of connectives. And here's quite a lot of my examples today are in French, but obviously it's a similar idea in Spanish. You say tengo for age, which is not the same as in English. So that's an important, you were testing something out here. We're testing an important misconception or mistake that's often made. People often say, je suis un enfant, or soy 9 años, for example. And so you deliberately would choose sentences that you know would be good for children to be able to write and speak, but also perhaps sentences where children often might make mistakes. So you're therefore gleaning, you're getting some information there about whether have they understood your teaching and have you managed to preempt any possible mistakes. And then what happens when everyone shows their mini whiteboard, it's always good to do it at the same time. So I'd always go toi de montrer or tres dos uno, 3, 2, 1, everyone has to show me at the same time. There's no point 1 or 2 students showing because the other ones will look around and see what they've written, and so it defeats the whole object of you finding out what children can do individually. A common mistake with this particular phrase, I like playing, is they don't translate it as I like to play. So sometimes they get the verb for the jouer or the jugar word wrong. So that's why I might have chosen this. And if I want them to be able to use extended sentences for themselves, I want a bit more detail. So I just don't want them to just say, I like playing football. I want some more detail with my friends and also in the park. So I'm modeling what an extended sentence would look like here as well. So that's what's called responsive teaching, and I'm sure that you are doing this that often in your lessons, and it's good to do it deliberately. So it's good to plan opportunities for it, and that's why I quite like creating these as PowerPoint slides in advance, because it both reminds me what I wanted to do in the lesson. It's the pre-planning and the pre-thinking makes me think of exactly what sentences I want to use. But what will happen is if I'm finding that children are making the same mistakes a lot, then I'm going to do a bit of reteaching, and then I might practice that a similar sentence to a structure that lots of them have got wrong. So I might go off piste a little bit, and that's the whole point about responsive teaching. So we can pre-plan some slides, but we need to also have the confidence to go off piste from the original plan if it looks like the children are making mistakes over and over again. And the great thing about that, and people say to me, well, isn't that too much mini whiteboard work, and isn't there not enough opportunities for actual written work that you can show in books? And I would say to that then is afterwards you could then give them a series of sentences you want them to translate or to write, but at least these will be accurate. So you will have preempted common mistakes. So instead of lots and lots of sentences where they're making the same mistake over and over again, there's less, but they're more accurate. So I do think it's worth spending that time doing lots of mini whiteboard practice work in advance. So I want to sort of move on now to different types of assessment. So there is what's called descriptor-based assessment, which was the old national curriculum, which you may be familiar with, came out in it was a number of levels. It went up to level 8, and then I think a level 9 was added. So levels 1 to 4 were, before the primary languages came into place, children would tend to get to a level 4 by the end of year 7 in 1 year. And you often would expect now that a child doing, say, half an hour to 40 minutes of French or Spanish every week during Key Stage 2, so during year 3, 4, 5, and 6, would move up one of those levels, those old style levels a year. So they would ideally get to the sort of old style level 4 by the end of year 6. And these were descriptors based on the 4 traditional language learning skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So I think it's helpful to look at something like this because it was good. It stood the test of time for many years. There was a decision to sort of get rid of it by Michael Gove and the Education Ministry at that time, but I don't think there was anything wrong with it personally. However, I want to now move on to what I think there's been a lot more thinking over the last few years. And in 2016, the Teaching Schools Council wrote a really excellent report about language learning and what were the effective pillars, the 3 pillars of language learning. And these were referred to recently by Michael Wardle, who is the lead Ofsted inspector for primary languages. He certainly focuses on them a lot. I was part of a webinar with him a few months ago in which he talked about them a lot. And so I think the 3 pillars, the 3 areas of progression which he talked about, which were phonics, vocabulary, and grammar, are things that we now need to focus on. And so these are sort of more up to date as they were. They're more in line with current thinking than the old style national curriculum levels. So a phonics, a phoneme style model of progression would look something like this. So in year 3, you expect children to identify phonemes and use some of them to aid understanding. So for example, in the French language, there are 36 phonemes and around 22 of them are very different between French and English. You want to front load the teaching of phonemes into really year 3 and 4, because if you don't do that, children will start making mistakes. Their common mistakes are when they're trying to pronounce cognates and words that look the same as they do between French and English, but are pronounced very differently. So an example of this would be something like chocolate. In English, we say chocolate. In French, we say chocolat. In Spanish, we say chocolate. So they all look very similar or the same, but they're pronounced differently. And there are about 40% of words in French and Spanish which are cognates with English. And so if we're not careful, if we don't teach the rules of phonics and the phonemes early, then children will start making mistakes, and all you'll end up doing is just correcting their mistakes all the time, whereas you want to preempt that. So in year 3, you're looking at quite a lot of different phonemes. Like I said, 22 altogether. And so between year 3 and 4, I'd be aiming at covering those 22 phonemes. And into year 4, we're looking at strings of phonemes as well. So a string of phonemes would be, for example, in a word like toi, the number 3, you've got 3 phonemes. You've got t, r, and wa, the oi phoneme, and you've got s as the silent letter at the end. So that's a string of 3 phonemes, which allows you to be able to say that word. And then year 5 and 6 are really around applying that knowledge of phonemes to full words and then full sentences and then more complex sentences. And they are all about developing and helping children to be able to speak and to listen appropriately. So they support the knowledge of phonics supports both of those skills. In Spanish, in contrast to French, has 26 phonemes. It has a lot less. Spanish is 99% phonetic as a language, which is why many people think it's quite and it's an easier language certainly to pronounce. It's not always easy when you get into the more difficult aspects of grammar, but what you see is what you get often in Spanish. And there are 16 phonemes in Spanish that you need to focus on, which are very different when you compare English and French. So they will be things like the r sound, which I don't do very well, the r sound, the double l like the y, the ny, and so on, and the vowel sounds. So a phonics model of progression is something that we need to think about in terms of how we assess children as well. And we also need to think about a vocabulary model of progression. And this would be an example in the scheme of work that I co-wrote with Juliet Park. This was what we put in. There's not a right or wrong, but these are common topics that you would put in, that you would include. And as you can see, by the end of it, we would be hoping for children to know around 450 words, which sounds like a lot, but actually it is very doable. By the end of a GCSE course, children, young people are expected to know 2,200 words, for example. So you can see that over 4 years of learning a language, that this, and we build it up bit by bit, that this is very accessible. And then a grammatical model of progression is also very important. And this is what we would suggest is the most important. So we start off with things like articles, nouns, agreements. There is another section to this, I think that's going to appear, yeah, so that's not the only thing. That moves into year 4 and 5 getting more and more difficult, such that by year 6 children can agree adjectives for number and gender. And then if we move on here, verbs is a really key aspect of progression, and it's mentioned in the Key Stage 2 programme of study. High frequency verbs are important. So first of all, in year 3, you'd learn them in the I form, the je suis, or the tengo, soy. And then in year 4, you'd learn them in the he and she form as well. High frequency verbs mainly being the verb to have, to be, and to go. But obviously, in addition, you'll teach a range of other common verbs like to play, to watch, things that children often do. You'd also include je voudrais and be able to say that eventually with another verb or with a noun. And then into year 5, you'll have the first, second, and third person. And into year 6, because the Key Stage 2, the National Curriculum for Key Stage 2 does say so that they should eventually know the full conjugation. Although I sometimes take exception to that, because I think children can actually be successful at GCSE without having to conjugate full verbs. But to show how verbs can be used in a more challenging way, we look at tenses. So in year 5, we should be looking at the near future tense, I am going to watch, for example. And then into year 6, we could learn some simple past tense phrases like I went, je suis allé, and fui, it was, c'était, fue, and so on. So those are some examples of how you can have a model of progression with verbs. Negatives are also important. And then we have things like prepositions and more complex language like more and less than. Another way that more recently, I'm thinking about the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of primary schools have moved to something called age-related expectations. Now, schools were meant to develop their own. There are no sort of set national standards. And myself and Juliet, when writing our scheme of work, have developed some age-related expectations broken down into different aspects of the skills. So I'm showing you an example of the skill of listening here. So there's different aspects of listening. So there's listening and understanding, and you can see how that develops in how there's progress there, how it gets more difficult. Listen recounts, they listen and they have to talk about it. Identifying the sound spelling link is around the phonics, and transcribing is listening and writing down what you hear, which is very much linked to your understanding of phonemes and making the sound spelling link, the phoneme graphing link as it's called. In terms of reading, again, this is broken down into just reading and understanding something, actually reading something out loud, which is linked with the skill of speaking, and that is also about making the sound spelling link. Being able to use reference materials like bilingual dictionaries appropriately, and then also applying some phonic knowledge to support reading. So you can see that we think that this is a more extended and easy to sort of understand way of showing progression and therefore linking to what we'd end up assessing in the different year groups. Then we've got speaking. So at the very simplest level, the first column is for year 3. That's just repeating simple words, maybe asking and answering some simple pre-learned questions like ¿Cuántos años tienes? ¿Cómo te apellas tú? Very simple greetings perhaps. Eventually into year 4, it moves into very short dialogues with 2 to 3 exchanges. We feel it's important to be very specific here about the number of exchanges. Into year 5, short conversations, that might be 3 to 4 exchanges, producing some extended sentences, perhaps using sentence builders as well. And then into year 6, taking part in short conversations. But it's important that the vocabulary and the structures used also develop in complexity to show that progression. Writing, it's important to differentiate whether children are given some support with writing, in which case you'd expect them to write more. So that could be something like a sentence builder, or just be able to write independently just from the knowledge of what's in their head, or to adapt a written model where again you'd expect them to be able to do more. Translation is always also a writing skill that's eventually tested at GCSE. And as we talked before with the mini whiteboards, translation of simple sentences is a really important skill for a language learner, and also gives you a really good indication as to children's understanding in particular of grammar, but also of vocabulary knowledge as well. And finally, because this is such an important part of language learning, but also it's very much on the agenda with Ofsted, is that children's cultural capital should be developed. And this is not a sort of right or wrong, but it's an example of how children can be introduced to things like traditional stories, traditional songs and poems, learning about festivals, authentic food and so on. But as I said, there's no right or wrong, but there should be something that you're mindful of when you develop a scheme of work and when you think about assessing it as well. I just thought it would be helpful here to show a model of progression in writing, because when people are assessing children's writing, they've often said to me, so what should I expect children to be able to write or do, or how long should it be? What sort of language should it be? So I've put this into English for you. I'm just going to move me up so you can hopefully read it as well as possible. And obviously the language in here links to what children would have learnt during that particular year, but also we expect them to remember what they've learned in previous years. And so it's good practice in a scheme of work to recycle previously taught language. Research says that children often need to have come across vocabulary and particular language items between 15 and 20 times before it sticks in their long-term memory. Therefore, recycling is absolutely vital, particularly with learning a language. I mean, it's vital in any subject, but because a language is quite abstract and the words are very different from the words we know in our native language, we have to keep reinforcing them over and over again. So we can see here that in year 3, it's at a very simple level. We've got a like and a dislike, which is important, and also I would like. In year 4, it moves on to asking a further question, describing the person themselves, talking about their family, and again, talking about likes and dislikes with regard to food. In year 5, very similar, but moves on to preferences. I prefer, reasons for opinions, because I like chips because they are delicious, and also asking a question. And then moving into year 6, we again, get slightly more complicated because we've learnt further language here. I want to move on now to thinking about summative end of year assessments. So some people like these because it means that you can sort of work up to children actually doing something in a more formal examine situation. Children are often used to having formal tests or exams, you know, the Key Stage 1 SATs and so on, so it's not something that they've never had before. And these are the sorts of assessments that you could complete, and it will give you a sort of a common baseline, as it were, so you can see from one year to the next how children have done percentage-wise, and if you want to translate those into mastery statements as well, that's also a useful idea. And it could also help you if you give similar assessments year on year to see how effective the teaching has been, and you can compare different year groups and see how well they are doing. So these sorts of assessments are very similar to the sort of simplest assessments that children are getting at Key Stage 3 as well. So with this listening assessment, children are listening to people talking about an animal, and they just have to listen for the particular animal item that they hear. So that's a year 3 style assessment at a very simple level. Again, we've got another year 3 style assessment. This time they're listening for a number, person saying how old they are. And then in question 6, it gets a little bit more complicated because they have to listen for both an opinion and a day of the week as well. So these people are saying which days of the week they like and dislike. And then moving on to a reading assessment. This is just first of all at word level. This is in year 3. So it's important that an assessment is differentiated. So you do start with some very simple assessment tasks for those children who perhaps only understand the language at word level. For the children who have got further than that and are fine with sentence and text level, they will find this very easy. But this will also show us which children, for example, perhaps the lower prior-attaining SEND children are managing word level, but they don't get any further than that. So it's important that your assessment gets gradually more difficult, but it does start with the quite simple activities. The second activity in this one is a very simple paragraph, and that the children wouldn't have to translate that word for word. They could just bullet point or summarize. Name's Jack, 5 years old, has a black and brown cat, loves Saturdays but hates Tuesdays. That's the sort of answer you'd expect in that one. And then in the writing assessment, just saying how old you are. So you'd expect someone to say, you know, j'ai 7 ans. A simple description. It's a good idea to give an example in an assessment like this. That is normally done even in GCSE level style exams, and it just helps clarity in terms of what the child is expected to do. And then a whole series of other sentences. There's quite a free rein here, so it's not an exact translation because the child can choose any colour. So if they can only remember one colour, then they can choose that one. And obviously they need to be able to give an opinion about it. We're still at year 3 here. So these, as you can see, are very, very simple. And then here it's just a question of writing the French for a series of different numbers. But we are expecting different types of phrases. We're expecting to be able to say I like, I hate, and in question 5, I would like. So the je voudrais construction is expected here, but they can use any animal they want with that. That's placing more importance on the actual verb, which is actually more important. So verbs are sort of like the tree trunk of language learning, and then the different items of vocabulary, like the branches that come off it. But you have to sort of be able to give opinions about every single topic that you come across in language learning. So it could be animals, it could be food, it could be school subjects, hobbies, that sort of thing. So it's a very high frequency type phrase, and therefore more importance is given to that in the assessment. And that's an important consideration when designing your assessments as well. It is a good idea to cover the 4 language learning skills. It can be a bit more tricky to assess children for the speaking exam, but a good idea is to have an activity that the children can all be doing quite independently, and then having them come up to the teacher's desk one at a time and asking them that series of questions. It can also be done at another time. So maybe when children are doing silent reading, or maybe when they're watching a short film, something like that. It's a good idea, especially some children feel self-conscious, to make sure that the other children aren't just all silent staring at them, because they might not perform as well as they want. But this is something that language teachers, I think, do need to get used to. And I think the sooner and the earlier you start even giving very simple assessments in speaking, I think it also heightens the priority that you give to speaking. It should be worth about 25% of a final exam. And but people, because they don't see it as a written exam that they complete, they don't always give it that same importance. But as we know, not only should it be given that importance, but for a language learner, if they feel that they can't speak the language, they just feel that they're useless at it, that they can't do it, even though they might be quite good at reading, writing and listening. Speaking is often what people will consider to be the most important skill, because they think about, if they're going to go abroad and want to make themselves understood. So we should really try and focus on the importance of speaking as early as possible. And that's also linked to the teaching of phonics as well, as early as possible, because that will give children the skills to be able to pronounce language accurately and therefore feel successful in the language. And we all know that motivation is a really important part of somebody feeling successful as a language learner. I'm now moving on to some examples of some end of year 5 assessments. These are part of the scheme of work that Juliet and I wrote from iLanguages. And this time you can see it's become more difficult because children have to find 2 pieces of information from each utterance. So again, there's an example here. So it's really clear that the answer will be in English. Sometimes children can make a mistake and put the answer in the target language, in French, Spanish, German. And it's important, therefore, that an example is given so it's really clear what you're expecting them to do. Another part of this listening exam would be actually 3 different items now in each utterance. This is part 3 of 3, I think. So it has got progressively more difficult. This time there's the item, the classroom item, how many of the items were, and the location of them. So that one gets a bit more difficult. And again, a reading exam, this time with 3 pieces of information. So 4 sentences. Again, an example is given there, and children have to just show their understanding of these. This is the first activity in the reading exam, so quite simple because they're split into separate sentences. It then gets more difficult, so it now moves to text level. I've got a short text, and we've got some questions in English. So these mirror a common assessment, reading comprehension assessment style. And in brackets, you've got the number of marks. The number of marks is important because it gives children a clue about how many items of information, how many details they need to provide. So that is considered good practice to include that. And as I said, it's a very common assessment style. There were a few more questions with that, but we're just moving on to the next one. We're moving on to writing. This is year 5. There's a picture, and following what children have learned using prepositions, they have to describe where the item is located. And we've got, again, an example in French this time, showing what will be expected. It's important to ask children that those are very specific pieces of writing that they had to write. It was either right or wrong, but it's important also to give children some free range writing style activities. So this is one around school subjects, just having to describe which ones they like, which they don't like, and saying why. And then finally, writing a short description of themselves, saying their name, age, birthday, sports and hobbies, and so on. So again, being quite specific, but also in bold are 2 items that children have to include, which is something that they're going to do in the future and something that they would like to have. So it's really clear that if these 2 specific language structures are included, then that's going to allow them to access the higher marks, and that would be part of the mark scheme, is that they would have to include those for the high marks. And then an example set of speaking assessment questions at the end of year 5. These speaking questions would have got progressively more difficult. They should have been practiced regularly in lessons. Again, like I said before, if you know what the final assessment's going to look like, you are then going to tailor your teaching appropriately, and you'll see the fact that children are going to have to answer a series of questions. So you'll do some activities in the lessons, during the year and leading up to the assessments to allow children to be successful in being able to answer these questions. I think it's important to have sample answers and a mark scheme, particularly if you're not the only teacher teaching the subject in your school, so we know what we're actually aiming for and we know where the marks could be given in this sort of speaking style exam, and the same would be the case in a writing exam too. And how should the assessments be graded is often a question. Well, you could just give a percentage. I suggest that you, if you're going to assess the 4 skills, that each are given a weighting of 25% each, because that mirrors good practice and it mirrors the GCSE exam as well. So you'd weight them appropriately. You could give a percentage to each skill, or you could just do a final percentage. And some schools are happy with saying, so-and-so got 67%, so-and-so got 55%. But if you want to use this sort of mastery style statements that many schools use now, Hertfordshire for Learning recommends this, and there's no right or wrong. So anything up to 25% is entering, anything between 26 and 60% will be called emerging, 61 to 80% is secure or securing, and then above 80 will be exceeding. So that's just an example. I think it's as good as any personally. And then in terms of collating the assessment evidence, some schools like to use these I can statements. I personally think it should be the teacher that assesses these and ticks them off. You could ask the child to self-assess if you wanted, but it shouldn't be solely child assessed. But I think probably the teacher is the best judge as to whether or not a child has met those standards. So again, that's another way of doing it. Again, you'd not want to know what your expectations are. You'd have to have this ready in advance of your teaching, because you'd want to, make sure that what you're teaching is allowing the children to be successful in these particular expectations. So that is pretty much me done now. I'm just going to add I kind of forgot to put my email address on, so I usually give people my email address. And also, if you're wanting more examples of these assessments and the resources that I showed you, so 2 things to go and have a look at are, you can email me for further questions, and also go and have a look at our website, and you can get hold of some free resources as well there, which include assessments and so on. I've just realised I spelled that wrong. So go and have a look there. You can see examples of assessments that I've shown you, and if you've got any further questions that you think of, or if you're watching this later and not live and would like to ask me any questions, please feel free to email me. So right now I'm going to have a look at the Q&A. Okay, so, right, so the answer to person who wrote Leverage Leadership, which is around, one of the things he mentions is about assessments, creating your assessments before you create your lesson plans and schemes of work. I can't remember, he's got a hyphenated name, but I think it's Samboyo Bambrick, but it might be the other way around. But if you Google that, you'll find him. He's absolutely excellent, and I've learned a huge amount from him around many different things in terms of school leadership, but in particular around assessment. How do you mark translations points wise? It depends on the length of the translation. So in GCSE paper, translations either get 2 or 3 marks. So for a sort of standard sentence, I'd probably give 2 marks, and for a longer one that's maybe got some further detail, maybe it's an opinion with a reason and a bit more detail, I'd give 3 marks. And I tend to just sort of look at it and think, is that, sort of pretty much half right? If I was a native speaker, would I understand about half of it? Is it completely wrong? Is it completely unintelligible? Then it's 0. If they've got pretty much everything right, maybe just one tiny mistake like an accent wrong, I would tend to give them full marks. So I'll put 2 or 3 points based on length of sentence. So no, I don't use a textbook. I don't think I'm actually aware of any textbooks in languages. So I use the iLanguages Key Stage 3 scheme of work, which exists for French and Spanish. And like I said before, you can have a look at some, you can get hold of it from here, and you can look at some free resources as well from there. I think that question is, how do you mark the longer writing pieces? I would tend to give 12 marks for a sort of piece that's maybe around 6 sentences. I tend to give around 2 marks per sentence. So I think about what am I expecting children to be able to do if it was in year 6 and children are able to write at length, and they could perhaps write 10 sentences. I would give say 20 marks for 10 sentences. And then again, it would be a sort of taking a global best fit judgment in terms of accuracy. How long do you have per week for the lessons? It's doable on 30 minutes a week, minimum. But ideally, I would say, 45 would be better. And an hour is ideal, but it is doable on 30 minutes. But they have to be, obviously you have to use every minute well, and it has to be sort of incredibly well planned. Yes, it's right that the complexity of language assessed is similar to end of year 7 content. That's exactly what would be expected after 4 years of learning a language. Then you would expect children to have reached a similar level by the end of year 7, because they'd have had a similar amount of, probably actually had more teaching time. But obviously they're going to go a bit more slowly when they're younger. So yeah, after 4 years of learning a language, I would expect end of year 7 proficiency. It does depend on the child, obviously, and there are some children who are lower prior retainers who aren't going to meet that, just as in any. When you assess a written activity, would you allow children to use vocab lists? I would expect them to recall from memory, and therefore I would give mini vocab tests on a regular basis, probably every 2 to 3 weeks, just like they have spelling tests in English as well, because again, part of our sort of focus around retrieval practice is that if children aren't memorizing things and they're not going into their long-term memory, then they're not actually going to be able to produce that language independently. Where are we? I'm just aware I've only got a couple of minutes left. I'd assess SEN children in the same way, but I'd probably just give them the first of the assessments that I was showing you. So maybe just pictures of things, and then they have to listen and match, or read and match. It depends again, obviously the children who have SEN needs in lots of different ways, but if they are cognitively needing support, then that's the sort of activity I would give them. Yes, I believe my slides are going to be made available, and also I think this recording is going to as well. So I'll be sending a copy of my slides to the language show. Can I adapt assessments to bilingual pupils? Yes, I'd say you could. Obviously that's going to be a lot more challenging because you expect those children to have have a much higher level of knowledge. I'm going to be starting Spanish from scratch. Is it okay to start with the same topic? Absolutely, yeah. I would just, you can probably just go faster with the older children. So, you'd start with the same sort of level of language, but you can just need to repeat it and reinforce it a lot more times with the younger children. But you can probably go a lot faster with, say, the year 5 and 6. In year 7, they would have learning homeworks at primary level. So I'm going to answer this live. This will be my last answer. I do think children should have learning homeworks for French at primary school. I think it will reinforce the, the importance of the language. There's lots of really nice language learning apps that they can use, so they can go home and do some fun things on these apps, which you can tell parents about. So it doesn't have to be done in a sort of negative, oh yeah, another homework kind of way, or you could use an app like Memrise, which is also excellent for language learning. So that's me done now. It's been a bit strange doing it like this. I do hope we get back to normality next year. And I wish you all the best with your primary language learning and teaching, and also assessment. Thank you, everybody. And thank you to everyone who's listened, maybe lying in the bath and things like that. And as I said, do feel free to email me. Thanks, everybody. Lovely to see your comments in the chat. Makes me feel almost like we were here in person, not quite, but also almost. Bye-bye, everybody.